Okay, so as we said in our introductory video that we will start studying the thorax by studying the thoracic wall or the thoracic cage, which is a musculoskeletal cage or wall. So we will divide the videos into two parts. In this part we will talk about the skeletal framework, and in the next video we will talk about the muscular and neurovascular components. So regarding the bones of the thorax, there are three sets of bones that forms the thoracic wall. Anteriorly we have the sternum, posteriorly are the 12 thoracic vertebrae with their intervertebral discs, and on each side we have 12 ribs, 12 on the right and 12 on the left. So starting with the sternum, you can see that it is a flat bone. It has anterior surface, posterior surface, right edge and left edge, and the sternum is divided into three parts. The upper part, which looks like a clenched fist، إذا تلزم قبضة إيدك تباوع عليها من الخلف ويشبهها. This is called the manubrium sterni. And then we have the largest part in the middle, which is the body of the sternum, and inferiorly there is the terminal tip, which is called the xiphoid process or the Ziphy sternum. The manubrium sterni is roughly square in shape, تقريبا مربع الشكل. It has upper and lower borders, right and left borders. On the upper border we can see that there are three notches. In the middle, the notch is known as the jugular or suprasternal notch, and you can feel this easily on your body. Next to the jugular notch on each side is an articular surface, which is the clavicular notch. Here the medial end of the clavicle will articulate to form the sternoclavicular joint. On the right and left borders of the sternum there is an articular facet or articular notch for articulating with the first rib, and on its near its lower end there's a hemifacet or demifacet, يعني نصف surface, for articulating with the second rib. This means that the second rib articulates with both the manubrium and the body. نص راح يكون على المانوبريوم والنصف الآخر على البody. The lower border of the sternum, of the manubrium sterni, here will articulate with the body of the sternum، وهاي المنطقة نسميها the manubrio sternal joint. لاحظ من هاي الصورة إنه the sternum هو ككل it is slightly oblique, and the obliquity of the manubrium is greater than the obliquity of the body, creating an angle. إذا نمشي إيدنا، أي واحد يقدر يمشي إيده على الستernum because it is subcutaneous، راح يلقى إنه أكو خسفة وراء المانوبريوم sterni، تنزل إيدك بهذا الشكل. This angle, the sternal angle of Louis at the manubriosternal joint, is a very important surface landmark as we will see later on. فكان هذا عندنا هو المانوبريوم سترناي. نجي للجزء الثاني اللي هو the body of the sternum، تقريبا مستطيل الشكل، ويحتوي على articular facets on the sides, on the right and left side, for articulating with the half of the second rib, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then half of the seventh. فعندي الضلع السابع مثل الضلع الثاني راح يكون نصفه على البody of the sternum والنصف الآخر على نهاية الستernum اللي هو xiphoid process. So the body of the sternum will articulate with the second to the seventh ribs. There are some transverse ridges on the anterior surface، ارتفاعات بشكل أفقي على الانterior surface. هذه سببها إنه originally the body of the sternum is composed of 4 pieces يكون مكون من 4 قطع منفصلة عن بعض نسميها the sternibry, which will later on fuse with each other and form the body. فمناطق الفيوجن راح تتحول إلى transverse ridges. The last part of the sternum is the xiphisternum or the xiphoid process, and this is very variable. يختلف من شخص إلى شخص. مثل ما قلنا هو يتمثل ويا نصف الضلع السابع on the side. In many people it is pointed or triangular in shape. It may be bifid, ممكن يكون مفطور. It may be perforated, ممكن يكون بفتحة بالوسط. It may be square or it may be rounded. So it is very variable in position, in shape. Now the positions of these areas can be correlated with the vertebral column. نقدر نحدد هذه المناطق اللي ذكرناها اللي هو بداية السترنم, manubriosternal joint, xiphisternal joint or xiphisternal junction. هذه إلها مقابل على الvertebral column, وهذه الليفلز مهمة من الناحية السريرية. So at the level of the jugular notch or the suprasternal notch, if we go backwards, إذا نرجع إلى الخلف, إحنا راح نمر بالدisc between T2 and T3. It is opposite the level of the disc between T2 and T3. The sternal angle or the manubriosternal joint, which is a very important landmark, lies opposite the disc between T4 and T5. The xiphisternal junction or the xiphisternal joint lies opposite the T9 vertebra, and the tip of the xiphoid process usually lies opposite T10 vertebra. So you can see from this picture that the sternum anteriorly is much shorter than the thoracic part of the vertebral column posteriorly. وهذا راح يسبب لنا مشكلة هسه ويا الربس من تريد تسوي articulation. This is an anterior view of the sternum, the manubrium, body, and xiphisternum, and these are the rib attachments, the first and half of the second to the manubrium, then the second to the seventh are to the body, and finally we have the xiphisternum. Always remember that the first rib is hidden or covered by the clavicle and we cannot feel it. So when we go down on the manubrium over the sternal angle, the rib which lies opposite the sternal angle is the second rib, and from here we can feel and count the ribs downwards. The second part of the bones that form the thorax are the ribs. The ribs are long bones. They are twisted, elongated, and curved bones, and we can classify the ribs in two ways. The first way to classify the ribs is according to their anterior attachment, to their sternal attachment. Each rib, most of the rib is composed of bone except for the anterior most part, which is cartilage, and this is known as costal cartilage. الجزء اللي يوصل يم السترنم هذا يتحول إلى cartilage ويصير اسمه costal cartilage. بقية الرب اللي هو راجع إلى الخلف ومتمفصل ويا الvertebral column هذا عبارة عن bone. So the ribs, all of the ribs, all 12 of them articulate posteriorly with the vertebral column. فهي دائما تبدي من الvertebral column. Anteriorly their end is different. You can see that in the first 7 ribs, أول 7. Each rib articulate with the sternum anteriorly and individually alone. يعني هذا جاي وحده ويا السترنم ما منطخ بأخو. That's why these ribs, the first 7, are called the true ribs, أو الاسم الاناتومي العلمي مالتها vertebro-sternal ribs, from the vertebral column to the sternum. The second group of ribs are the 8th, 9th, and 10th. These ribs also begin at the vertebral column, But when they come anterior, their costal cartilages join each other and then join the costal cartilage of the seventh. وهذا السفنث هو راح يوصلهم إلى الستernum. That's why they are called false ribs. أو الاسم العلمي مالتها نسميها vertebrochondral ribs. From the vertebral column, chondral means cartilage. توصل إلى حد الcostal cartilages. The last two, the 11th and the 12th ribs, begin posteriorly also at the vertebral column. Anteriorly they end in costal cartilages that do not attach to each other and they do not reach the sternum. كلش بعيدة، فلهذا نسميها the floating ribs or the vertebral ribs. Vertebral لأنه فقط متصلة بالvertebral column. So we have the first 7 true or vertebrosternal، 8 9 10 false or vertebrochondral, 11th and 12th the floating or vertebral. Floating because they lie between the layers of the anterior abdominal wall muscles and they move up and down during breathing between these muscles. That's why they are called floating. This is the first type of classification of the ribs. The other type of classification is according to their anatomical features. We classify the ribs into typical and atypical ribs. Typical هي مجموعة من الأضلاع تشترك كلها بنفس الصفات. They contain the same features. هذه نسميها typical ribs. If one or more of these features is not present، فقدنا واحدة أو أكثر من هذه الخواص، هذا يتحول من typical يصير atypical rib. The typical ribs are the 3rd to the 9th ribs، من الضلع الثالث إلى الضلع التاسع. هذه الأضلاع مشتركة بصفات معينة. شنو هاي الصفات؟ First of all, they are long, curved and twisted. لازم تكون طويلة. curved فيها هذا الكيرف. twisted معنى كلمة twisted انه هنا اذا نباوع this is the posterior end، هذا هو الانتيريور surface مالتها. من افترت هنا البوستيريور surface تحول الى عفوا هذا الانتيريور surface راح يتحول الى posterior surface. هذا المقصود ب twisted. So they are long, curved and twisted. Posteriorly each typical rib ends with an expanded part. هذا الجزء المتضخم نسميه the head of the rib. This is the head of the rib. And on the head you can see that there are two articular surfaces. عندي نقطتين for articulation, and between the articular surfaces is an elevation called the crest of the ribs. ليش نقطتين؟ لأنه قاعدة تقول إنه the typical rib articulates posteriorly. هذا posterior end يعني جهة الvertebral column، فراح يروح يسوي articulation with the vertebra. The typical rib articulates with the bodies of two vertebrae, the corresponding vertebra and the vertebra above. شنو معناتها؟ هذا مثلا عندي هنا هو الضلع السابع. It articulates with the body of the corresponding vertebra. Corresponding vertebra meaning the vertebra that has the same number. فإذا هو الضلع السابع راح يتوصل ويا الفقرة السابعة and the vertebra above، والفوقاها أو القبلها فراح يتوصل ويا الفقرة السابعة والفقرة السادسة. فلهذا نلقى أنه عندنا two articular surfaces, one for the corresponding vertebra and one for the vertebra above. The crest in the middle will be attached to the disc between the two vertebrae. هذا posterior expanded end اللي هو الhead. After the head there is a small constriction. This is called the neck, and then there is an elevation in the bone called the tubercle. The tubercle is also composed of two parts, one smooth part which is an articular part, and the other is a rough part which is non-articular part. The articular or smooth part will articulate with the transverse process of the same vertebra. فنرجع هنا هذا الضلع السابع، هذا هو الارتيكولار بارت اوف ذا tubercle متمفصل ويا الترانسفيرس بروسيس مال الفقرة السابعة، بينما الهيد نص على الفقرة السابعة ونص بالآخر على الفقرة السادسة. كل هذه الاستراكشرز هيد نيك tubercle صايرة تقريبا horizontal بالposterior end of the rib، وراح يبدي الرب يتحول إلى الانتيريور surface of the body، فراح يخلق لي هنا الزاوية. This is called the angle of the rib. And when we are sleeping supine أو من تيجي أنت تنيم الهيكل العظمي على ظهره، the touch points of the thorax، كل مناطق التاتش مالت الثوراسيك كيج راح تكون على الانجلز، وهاي الانجلز تشتغل مثل arches مالت الفوت، أيضا تقدر تتحمل البريشر والويت مال human body. From the angle, the shaft of the rib, this is called the shaft or the body of the rib, will curve anteriorly downward and forward. يمشي بس مو horizontal، يمشي بشكل مائل إلى الأسفل وإلى الأمام إلى أن يوصل تقريبا إلى الميد كلافيكولار لاين. هنا يخلص البون ويبدي عندي cartilage coastal cartilage. هنا الكوستال كارتلج راح يمشي باتجاه معاكس، هذا كان يمشي downward and forward، هذا راح يصعد يمشي upward and forward. ليش تصير هذه الميلة؟ لأنه ذكرنا قبل شوية أنه the sternum اللي هو راح يتصل بالرب is much shorter than the vertebral column، فلازم يصعد له الرب. In the shaft of the rib or the body of the rib راح نلاحظ أنه عندي outer surface و inner surface، يعني مضغوط من الجهتين، وب upper border، هذا ال upper border يكون round and thick، and there is a lower border. The lower border is thin, and on the lower border there is a groove. This groove is called the costal groove. All the main intercostal arteries, veins and nerves run in this groove، تمشي بهذا الجروف. كل هذه الصفات اللي قلناها اللي هو شكل الهيد، articulation مالته، the neck، the tubercle its parts، the presence of the angle، the elongation of the body، the borders، groove، the cartilage، هذه كلها صفات typical ribs. والtypical ribs مثل ما قلنا هي the third to the ninth ribs. إذا نجي هسه للother ribs اللي هي atypical حتى نشوف شنو اللي صار بها اختلاف بحيث صارت atypical ribs. First of all, the first rib. You can see in the first and second ribs, first of all, they are not long. They are short. فأنا فقدنا صفة مهمة. The first rib has only one articular facet on its head for articulation with T1. ما راح يصعد للفقرة الفوقاها اللي هي C7. فبدال ما يكون عنده two articular facets عنده one articular facet on its head. And moreover, it is not flattened from side to side، يعني ما بي inner surface و outer surface، upper border و lower border، بالعكس هو مضغوط من الأعلى إلى الأسفل، so that it has superior surface and inferior surface، inner border and outer border، عكس بقية الأضلاع. And on the upper surface we can see that there are two grooves, the anterior groove for the subclavian vein and the posterior groove for the subclavian artery, and between these two grooves there is a tubercle formed by a muscle called scalenus anterior, so it is called the scalene tubercle. The second rib is almost as twice long as the first rib، بس همينه يبقى short. So it also has upper and lower surfaces, and it has another tubercle called scalenus anterior. فهذه فقدت وحدة أو أكثر من الصفات مال typical ribs. إذا ننزل الأضلاع الجوية 10 11 12 خاصة 11 و 12. In the 11th and the 12th ribs we can see that there's only one articular facet on the head, also on the 10th, for articulating with the corresponding vertebra only. In the 11th and 12th, you can see an important thing missing, which is the tubercle. There is no tubercle. هذا معناته there is no articulation with the transverse process. That's why they float freely in the anterior abdominal wall, and they are called the floating ribs. And also they are short in length. الطول مالتها كلش قصير. هاي 11th and 12th. The ribs, because of their orientation and shape, increase in length and obliquity from the first rib downwards. من نبدي احنا ما نقدر نحس الضلع الاول، نقدر قلنا اول شيء نحسه الضلع الثاني. كل ما ننزل ويا الربس نشوف انه الطول مالتها يزيد الى ان نوصل الى الضلع السابع. So that the longest rib is the 7th rib. The obliquity, الميلان مالتها, also increases, so that the most oblique rib is the 9th rib. ورا الضلع السابع تبدي الأضلاع تقصر مرة أخرى، وورا الضلع التاسع تبدي الميلان مالتها يتعدل وتصير more horizontal. This will create the barrel shape of the thorax. يصير شكله مثل البرميل، بحيث انه the largest transverse diameter، اكثر منطقة عرض بالثوركس راح تكون على مستوى the 7th rib، بينما largest anteroposterior diameter اللي هي تتبع الميلان راح تكون على مستوى الضلع التاسع. آخر جزء من skeletal framework of the thoracic cage is the vertebral column, or the thoracic part of the vertebral column. You know from your previous study that the vertebral column is divided into several regions. We have the 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and finally the coccyx. Any vertebra in the body is composed of certain parts, fixed parts. Anteriorly, we have this mass of bone, which is called the body of the vertebra. From the body of the vertebra, there are 2 protrusions, and you know 2A, هذول البروتروجنز نسميهم the pedicles. And from the pedicles, there are 2 other protrusions, هنسميها the laminae, the lamina. The pedicle and the lamina form an arch, تسوي قوس من هاي الجهة ومن هاي الجهة، فتحيط لي هنا بفتحة behind the body. This is called the vertebral foramen, a ring of bone around an opening. And when these rings are located one above each other، من تصفت هاي الرنجات واحدة فوق الأخرى، راح تسوي لي vertebral canal اللي هي موجود بداخلها spinal cord. When the pedicle meets the lamina، من يلتقي البيديكل ويا اللامينا راح يطلع عندي process على جهة اليمين وعلى جهة اليسار. This is called the transverse process. When the 2 laminae unite posteriorly راح يطلع من عندهم process إلى الخلف، هذا نسميه the spine of the vertebra, or the spinous process. So these features, the body, the vertebral foramen, the pedicles, laminae, transverse processes, and spines, are present in all vertebrae. In each region، في كل منطقة من الvertebral column، نشوف إنه some of the vertebrae مثل الربس مثل الأضلاع they share the same features، فهذول نسميهم typical vertebrae. And other vertebrae are different in one aspect or another، فنسميهم atypical vertebrae. This is the shape of a typical thoracic vertebra. شنو هي مواصفات typical thoracic vertebra؟ First of all, the body is medium sized and heart shaped. Medium sized meaning it's not as small as the cervical vertebrae, but still it's not as big as the lumbar vertebrae. It's somewhere in the middle between the cervical and the lumbar. فلهذا نلاحظ أن الثوراسيك vertebrae كل ما صعدنا إلى الأعلى هي صارت أصغر تشبه السيرفيكال، وكل ما نزلنا إلى الأسفل هي صارت أكبر تشبه اللمبر. ف the typical thoracic vertebra هي على الأغلب طبعا راح تكون هي T2 to T9 بالوسط صايرة. The typical thoracic vertebra T2 to T9 have medium sized heart shaped تشبه Valentine heart shaped body. The vertebral foramen هاي الفتحة الموجودة بها is small in size and circular in shape. شكلها دائري. On the body of the typical thoracic vertebra, on the sides of the body على جهة اليمين والشمال راح نشوف two articular facets for articulation with the corresponding rib and the rib below. هنا راح نعكس القاعدة بالأضلاع، قلنا أنه كل ضلع راح يتموصل ويا فقرته اللي تحمل نفس الرقم والفقرة اللي فوقاها. فمن رجعنا إلى الفرتبرا هسه نعكسها. لو فرضنا أنه هذه هي T6 راح تموصل ويا الضلع المقابل اللي هو الضلع السادس and the seventh rib with the rib, the corresponding rib and the rib below. فنلقى أنه two articular surfaces on the body of the vertebra. There is also an articular surface or articular facet on the transverse process. هنا راح تموصل ويا الtubercle مال corresponding rib. Again, if this is T6, this will be the area of articulation for the tubercle of the seventh rib. The transverse processes are generally short. The spines are long and inclined downwards. The spines of the typical thoracic vertebra تكون طويلة ونازلة إلى الأسفل. وقلنا the typical thoracic vertebrae are the second to the ninth vertebrae. If we take a look at the other vertebrae which are not typical, for example the first one, you can see that the body here is small, يشبه cervical. It is not medium sized. The articular facets on the sides of the vertebra, one is much larger than the other. The spine is not so much inclined downwards as the other vertebrae. مو كلش نازل إلى الأسفل. In the lower vertebrae, 10th, 11th and 12th, there is only one articular facet on the body. لأنه الأضلاع اللي هي 10 و11 و12 عندها articular facet واحدة على الهيد مالتها راح تتمفصل فقط ويا الفقرات مالتها. وهنا الفقرات تتمفصل فقط ويا الأضلاع المقابلة. The body you can see here is large. It looks like the lumbar vertebrae. The spine is short. It is not as long as the other vertebrae and it is not so much inclined downwards. So these were the components of the skeletal part of the thoracic cage. We studied the sternum and its parts, how it articulates with the ribs and how they are classified into parts, either true, false and floating, or typical and atypical, and you can combine these classifications. وشنو مواصفات typical والatypical ribs، وبنفس الطريقة شنو مواصفات typical والatypical vertebrae. عندكم بالكتاب راح تشوفوا الموضوع عن الجوينتس اللي موجودة بين هذه الأضلاع، ما راح نتكلم عنها، ومطلوبة منكم بالمرحلة الحالية اللي هي الكوستوفرتبرال والكوستوكوندرال جوينتس. من نجي على موضوع البريذنج وحركة الثوركس راح نتكلم عنها بشكل بسيط.